why don't we take a just 2 minutes of silence together, just to center ourselves in that power of love that really imbues and empowers our lives. Okay, I think we can gather ourselves here. Here's Chris.
Yeah, Ben.
Hello, Chris.
I have to change my name.
Oh, who are you really?
I'm Ben. I don't know why. Yeah, Chris is with me in the living school, and her name always comes up.
Okay, and you're not suffering from identity crisis of any sort, right?
I'm not. I don't think so. At least not at this moment.
Good.
I can change it from here, Ben.
Okay, there you go. So, let's see, we have 24 with us. So I think some are listening in and some we can see. So one of the beauties of this electronic age is it allows us to gather from all parts of the world, really, although many of us are from the States, and to really share and deepen the work of the Spirit in our lives today. We're at, I think, a very, very critical moment, I would say, in the history of the human community, and certainly in the history of the church. I do think, Patrick, I think we're at a critical threshold of evolution itself. And so I looked over some of your questions, which, excuse me, they're very good questions. And they're really at the heart of what the Omega Center is, the work of the Omega Center is aiming to do. And one of those aims are first to bridge science and religion. And while this may seem pedantic or scholarly, there's many, even in the 20th century, who recognize that our world has really unraveled because the two basic pillars of knowing, which is the way of knowing nature or the natural world, the things of matter, which would be science, and the things of knowing the spirit, have really become separate and seemingly in conflict in our own time, although they're really not in conflict. So Alfred North Whitehead said, the only way we can really move into a future, into a fruitful future, is by the reconciliation and the integration of science and religion. And when I look at the church crisis today, this is a crisis that's been probably going on for the last 1,000 years. I think it's just reaching a culmination because the structures of the church no longer can stay alive in a world of evolution, in a world of quantum physics, in a world that's dynamically interconnected. And so from where I sit, I think we are at an opportune time to, in a sense, return to the roots of the gospel. I do think the church really became disconnected from the power of the New Testament, which was the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, insofar as that life was meant to be about a new creation, a new community. God is doing new things. And I think by the 4th century, the politics of religion began to prevail. And I think what we have inherited really is an empire religion that really fit the empire of Constantine, who really brought this together. And so an empire religion in our globalizing world just doesn't work. It can't stand. So I do think this is an opportune time to, in a sense, enact Teilhard's vision. And that vision is really, I think, a return to the core of the gospel that God is doing new things, and that God is deeply involved in our lives, but that means we too must be doing new things. And I think if we were to ask, well, what does it mean to be a Christian today? What is our role? And the first thing I think I would say is you need to find an inner center of freedom to do new things. And I think by that I mean not being afraid to challenge. What do I say by challenge? Here's what I want to say is opposition doesn't really get us far. And Patrick, has been involved a lot in community organizing work, and so it's not a matter of opposing. It's a matter of transforming the times that we're in. And that could be as small as doing, the way we let me just step back and say, I think the whole thing begins first with an inner freedom and orientation towards a new understanding of God and a new understanding that the Christ life is our life. There's no... What's that? Oh, what's that? Did someone say something? Oh, I thought we heard something. So I think when someone asked about Christ consciousness, is it still evolving? Yeah, it is. I think we funny enough, after 2,000 years, we simply do not yet have an adequate understanding of Jesus as the Christ and what that means for us as people who have, who believe this way. I mean, as a way of life that can bring us to the fullness of life. And so I think that Christ consciousness is what our consciousness is about. I don't think that there's like a Christ out there, and we just have to kind of assent to that Christ. It's about Word made flesh. It's about God becoming, I want to say human, but, not only human, God becoming materiality, we might say. So the big overarching narrative here is evolution. This is what Teilhard really tried to bring home to us in a more explicit way. It is no longer business as usual. You cannot continue to keep a church functioning with 5th century, 8th century, 12th century prayers and structures in a world that is now not only in evolution, but that evolution is accelerating due to technology. And so the world is not only getting smaller, it's getting more globalized, meaning that the boundaries between what was, independent tribes in the past. I mean, those of us who are older and grew up with, Catholics on one block and Irish on another block, and the German church here and the Italian church here, that time is now past us. And it's a very different world, even in terms of contours. And when I say that, I also want to say this, that the human person is changing. That's not a superficial change. We truly are in evolution. There's a new type of humanity that is on the rise. Now, I think what we're not saying is it's not E.T., this is not coming to us from the outside. It's that we have always been in evolution. But I think we ran into a mindset that we have always been here. And certainly the Christian narrative sort of framed this for us, right? God made us, put us on earth. God came to redeem us, and, we're going to heaven. And that is so far from the actual, in a sense, the real narrative that is consonant with science, that we have been emerging, we emerge out of a less complex species, and we are, in a sense, emerging into a more complexified way of life. And God is involved in that whole kit and caboodle. So the Christ then really refers to that God enfleshment, even through the whole course of evolution. So Teilhard was really, in his many essays on Christianity and evolution, that's what he's saying is like, we don't have an over and done God. We have a God who is coming to be truly, and fully the Christ in and through us as we are becoming something new in our own lives. So I think, from where I sit, I think it's inevitable that something new will break forth in what we call the church. Now, what will that be? And what will that look like? And the funny thing is, there is no answer to that, right? There's no blueprint. In the same way that anything that emerges by way of choice and by way of action. And so, if the new is to emerge, it is us who are then the emergent church. And so it does matter then who we gather with to pray, how we shape those prayers. What words do we use? How do we include the wider cosmos in our prayers? How do we see ourselves? What kind of consciousness do we have of ourselves as, you might say, co-creators in this divine project? Do we see that Christ is now our life? There is no other Christ but us. And I guess, in terms of a Catholic church, well, I've always felt that Catholic meant wholeness. So I think any church that emerges has to be, it cannot be about parceling out the pure and the redeemed from the impure and the unredeemed. That just doesn't, it just won't get far in our world. We can try to move in that direction. That is simply not the world we're living in. We can take technology really as a litmus test of what our world is about. Young generations, it's horizontal relationships, right? It's WhatsApp, it's Instagram, it's Snapchat. It's all, being relational across horizontal boundaries. But those horizontal boundaries are actually new lines of transcendence. I think that's where, where divinity is actually taking on a new contour. So as Charles Taylor once said, God has not gone away. God is just showing up in new ways. And I think one of our challenges is to have eyes to see the new ways that God is emerging. And why do we say God? Because our basic existential questions remain with us. The quest for ultimate meaning, the quest for fulfillment, the openness of the future towards becoming something more. And we know that materiality itself cannot fulfill those questions. It may participate in them, but that name God points to that holy mystery of utter, of divine unity, of absolute fullness in love. And so, I think God is probably like, well, it's about time those guys down there, fell apart, so we can do something new, and get women on board and get a life-giving church going. And I want to say this too, because I teach undergraduates, and I asked them the other day, these are 18 and 19-year-olds, 18-year-olds, born in 2000. I'm like, so what do you think about religion? They're like, well, my grandmother practices it, or, we go to church on Christmas, or my family's not religious, but we go into nature and, we get in tune with nature. And it's not, it's nothing against them. It's simply not on their horizon at all. It's a goner before it even has a beginning. And what's sad about that is that a religion is that kind of gathering that tethers us to something more than ourselves. It's that spiritual ligament that binds us. And I think one of the missing pieces in our culture today is we have no tethering. What tethers us? What, in a sense, binds us to something more, to one another, and to something more than ourselves? And so Teilhard was really clear that religion should give zest to life. It should empower. It should energize us. It should be the very kind of evolutionary empowering of what we're about. And you look around today and people are like, I'm out of here. This is like so enervating for me. I'm so disillusioned and my energy is thwarted by all this. So it's just the opposite of Teilhard's vision of religion as the core of evolution. So let me just go back to your questions here. One of the things I think and if I can say this, I think a big problem we have, that's even more than the church, is our whole education system, and especially in those who go to seminary or religious education. It's really pretty 19th century. You know, it's really not up to date with modern science. So we're, you know, I can even talk about the theology department of Villanova, and they're very, very good people, but it's all over the map. No one really talks about modern science or technology except for me. So I'm not sure how we can get to any kind of religious worldview that empowers us towards transcendent life without updating all of theology. I think every aspect of it needs to be brought into dialogue and a relationship with modern science, and we're not doing that work. So that's why I think, you know, we're going to have a lot of difficult days ahead before things get better. So let me. There's one other question here, but let me just pause here. And can I open it to you out there, and let me hear what you're thinking, or maybe a question that you have at this moment in our gathering. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah.
You should be able to just unmute yourself, I believe.
Yeah, I just want to hear what, you know, are you on this same page, so to speak, or where are you in this moment of global history, and certainly where the church is in the U.S. today?
Ilia, can you hear me?
Yes, Marion.
Marion up here.
Hello.
I agree with everything you're saying, and I feel the same way. But knowing the church as long as I have, and I've been involved in teaching religion since the 60s and 70s, it moves like a snail. It crawls. It barely moves. I think we're going to go right back. I think this is all going to blow over. They're going to keep the safe environment. I'm involved in my parish, and they put you through all the safe environment stuff, which they put the lay people through it, and it's not the problem. Problem is not with all the lay people.
You're absolutely right, Marion. You know,
I'll be dead before it changes.
I don't think so. I don't know.
I mean, that sounds pretty negative, but I don't think it's going to move very fast.
You're absolutely right on one hand, right? So the way the church will deal with this will be, we'll have a bishop's meeting. They'll issue a pastoral statement of some sort. Nothing structural will change. And so the only way something can really change, I mean, you'd have to go back to the Reformation to realize that only change comes about through real action. So someone at some point must, in a sense, make an act that is a public act, almost like Luther nailing the 97 Theses on the door, you know, that symbolizes and signifies no more, you know, that something new is about to change. Now, the question is, you know, who will be that person? You know, because it will be a person. You can't wait for a committee to, you know, just vote or wait for the Vatican to issue some statement. You are absolutely right. It's not going to happen. But I do think something must happen and will happen. And I think it will be someone who is inspired. In other words, it's someone like many of the prophets of the past, many of the great reformers in our own age. Someone is impelled like a fire that pushes them into that public sphere to do something new. And I think that's what will happen.
I do see women religious, you know, and I get the newsletter to the Leadership Women's Conference, and I see other religious communities, and they are coming out. They're making stands. But people are not listening to them. I mean, the more conservative people in the parishes are blowing them off. Oh, they're liberal nuns, don't pay attention.
Yes, right.
You know, and so, and they don't, I guess the church isn't listening to them. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they will eventually.
Yeah. Well, Marion, let me just say this. I think, you know, there's a lot, as you can see, right, there's a lot of factions today because people gravitate to like-mindedness, right? So, you know, some will say, oh yes, Pope Francis will be, you know, ousted and the church will be reformed and we'll go back to the Benedict church, right? Others are saying this is an opportunity for reform and let's do something new. I would say this, and here's maybe the way I approach things. I let all this stuff in ear and out another ear. I don't pay any attention to it. You have to really attend to what God is calling you in your life. That's really where the power comes from. Otherwise, we are actually dissipated in our energies. We're thinned out. And what happens is people get thinned out, they get frustrated because they're tired, and nothing effective is changing. And nothing effective really can change unless we have that a deeper power from within us. So my advice would be, you can let them talk, but you don't have to really listen. You know what I mean? You don't have to respond. People need to be, have to, but I would just think, and I think every person does have a part in this, but you have to be, in a sense, that part can only come from within you. Your inner power of thinking new, and your hope. And I think one of the things, if you read the New Testament, the first letter of Peter says, we must give reason for the hope that lies within us. Do we have hope? And I think hope is not something that comes about through a conversation or a document. Hope is really born of the Spirit. And I think this is a time, it's a new time of testing faith, in a sense. It's like as if God were to say, like, just how much do you believe, in this New Testament? How much do you believe in this in this person of Jesus Christ? I mean, how important to you is this message of the gospel? And I think that's what our response is. Yeah, I really believe, and I believe that God is, not just out there doing new things, but in my life. So the first thing to become new is us, right? We have to have a new mind and a new heart, and that's where I would say, don't let yourself get too thinned out, by the many, many, many conversations and many, many, many opinions that are going about today.
Ilia?
Yeah.
As I mentioned before, I just came back from our annual congregational meeting, and I am again, as I'm back here, I'm again wondering about the thing that I noticed quite a few years ago, when you identified that one of the most important things right now is for us to really develop this inner capacity. So I think that's what I'm called to. But I think others, I really have been using the science to say how connected we are. But I'm really conscious that in trying to maybe translate some of the language, that it might sound like, especially with the sisters, like, oh yes, let's just go home and say our prayers. Well, and that's not it. But I remember the urgency with which you said, we're only going to renew ourselves if we really commit ourselves to this.
Right.
And I'm just wondering about that in trying to connect, in trying to converse with others. I always felt I was a translator, and I can do that. But I don't want it to sound like, well, let's just, some people hear it as, well, let's just do what we've always done.
Yeah, right. So I think part of the problem is that what we're experiencing are people at different levels of evolution of consciousness. I think that's really what's happening. I think there are some people who have come to when I say a different level of consciousness, their consciousness has been more integrated in terms of taking the signs of the time, the things that they've known, and that comes about through just the way people. It's a complex of factors, personal factors and environmental factors. But I think we're meeting a lot of people who are at different levels of consciousness insofar as their consciousness has not been really integrated into the present moment. And it's not that they haven't done the work. I mean, they may say their prayers and all this kind of stuff. What can happen sometimes is I do think that the brain, and it's a kind of an evolutionary thing. Remember the old fight and flight, fight or flight syndrome? There's something of that. Deep fear will cause the brain to freeze. It will kind of lock in certain, we know what we know, and we're afraid to let go of what we know because we fear of being annihilated, of being eaten alive, so to speak, by the unknown. And I think that's what we're talking about. When we talk about doing the inner work, we're really talking about coming to that place of inner freedom where we know God to be present, where we know that divine love embraces us, and no matter what happens, that we will not be let go. And so if we can come to that deeper level of inner freedom, then our minds, in a sense, are liberated to embrace new ideas. But I do see within the church and, within religious life that people are, they're fearful more than anything. And it's much safer to stay with what we have known, even though it's mediocre and it's not really all that much life-giving. But I'd rather do that than throw myself out, into the, raging automobiles that are coming my way and risk death. But that's the whole point. And, this is the whole point. I think this moment we're living in is, in a sense, a cruciform moment. It does call for death. That is the whole point. And that's the part somehow it doesn't really click for us. Somehow we so much want the life, we want more life for our generations. We want, we want a better world up ahead and all this kind of stuff. But the whole point of the New Testament is no life without death. And so I think our problem right now is dying. We're having a hard problem dying. And so I think if we can embrace death, as St. Francis says, as sister death, not just our physical death. I mean, it can be our spiritual death, our historical death, our, what we've known death. Because the truth is, there is no death in God. And it's sort of the amazing mystery that we're engaged in. Hi, Stella. I think right now the church is refusing to die. This is really, I think what we're seeing is that the church is refusing. It's sort of, the church is in conflict with its own basic truth claim. And this is really at the heart of the problem. It refuses to undergo that letting go. But, as Eric Jans, the system specialist, says, to live with an evolutionary spirit is to let go when the right time comes and to engage new structures of relationship. That, you could put that saying on the cross of Jesus, right? That's exactly what he did. And so I would say, with the sisters, with parts of the church, it's like the refusal to die. And the refusal to die is death. That is the whole point. It's the mystery. If you refuse to die, you will die. Isn't this exactly what Jesus says in the Gospels, right? Unless a grain of seed falls to the ground and dies, it remains a grain of seed. And it will just stay that little old seed until it withers out, and then who cares about it? But if it dies, it will bring about a harvest of abundant life. And there's something about this core truth, which really runs, I think, through all the religions. I think we could probably look at other religions with the same symbolic archetype as well. Death and life. This is the crux of the matter. Right now, we are facing a death moment in evolution, and we're refusing it. I think we're in conflict with it, and it's killing us.
Ilia, you spoke earlier about a new humanity, and I think one of the ways that a new humanity is showing up is the refusal of young people to choose a gender.
Yes, yeah.
So many people in our community in Austin and in other places that I travel,
yes,
where non-duality is showing up as a non-binary way of being human. And that to me is a very interesting phenomenon that's showing up more and more. And that is a way that new humanity is coming forward.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning. Hi, Michael and Pam. Good to see you. Yeah, absolutely. Again, part of the new humanity that is emerging, which I do think has been accelerated by technology. And so I do think, as the brain is rewired, in other words, the brain as a plastic organ that, responds to the dominant culture, dominant stimuli, it's rewiring across different lines of relationality. And part of those lines are the overcoming the distinction of what we used to call ontology of being. You're a male, I'm a female, you're Asian, and I'm white. But we know that, when in technology, when we use our electronics, we're informationally driven. apart from boundaries. It's non-bounded relationality. And I think out of that non-bounded relationality, we are seeing then a shift in gender insofar as there's a liberation of boundaries. That's really what we're witnessing to. And that liberation of boundaries then, I think, does lend to a non-dual type of relational personhood. And so people are free to say, hey, I'm transgender, I'm gay, I'm lesbian, or whatever it is, or I'm just bi, I can be, a plurality of things. And so I think what we are seeing is sort of the liberation of sex. And so far as like if a biological sex, you're XX or XY genetically, that it does not determine gender, because gender is part of personhood. Gender is part of, the sexuality that's expressed by person. And so that gender can then be plural, across the lines of relationship that give what? The fecundity of life. And that's why I do love younger generations. I think I've declared myself as a either a millennial or a Gen Xer, just in an older body. I think it's very exciting, actually. And I see a new type of person clearly. I was talking to a colleague about this. What I would envision is that the modern person, as we've known that person, was sort of coordinates that were sort of horizontal and vertical, right? Your religious self, your communal self, and family self. I see a new person that's emerging that I would call maybe hexagonal, polygonal, but at least 6 or more lines across religions, across genders, across nationalities and cultures. And so I see this kind of new configuration of personhood on the horizon, and it will contribute to, and that's why the whole question of church and spirituality is interesting, because that new type of person is going to think really in a new way about religion and church. Yeah. So, great question.
Ilia?
Yes.
I wonder if in addition to that, about the new type of humanity, that there's something similar going on in our religious and spiritual realm, analogous to gender, where people are beginning to detach from these historic structures. At least some people that I know, and probably most people here in this conversation are somehow maybe rooted in their tradition, but they're beginning to transcend.
Right.
Just like we may be biologically rooted in some sort of sex one way or the other, but our gender doesn't have to be.
Exactly.
So
yeah, I think you're right. I think we are witnessing that. In fact, the conversation here, when we talk about, I think even as we talk about a religious tradition, even our framing of that is not to the exclusion of other traditions, which in the past it might have had a different consciousness, a framework. And I think, what we are experiencing is a shift in consciousness, and that consciousness being a more integrated across, religious traditions. So, I think the religious terrain clearly is, even in terms of human consciousness, that human religious consciousness is emerging in a more complexified way. So I do think, as we see with younger generations, a homogeneous tradition, Christian or Lutheran or, or Protestant or, that's still, it's becoming more and more foreign to them, or at least they're like, well, that's interesting, but they're like, well, what about Buddhism and what about Hinduism? So, I think, and what this is calling us to is to think in a new way about religion and personhood. Again, I think being attentive to the language we're using around questions of personhood and religion. We're in this kind of mediating period. We have something of the old with us, and yet we are ever more cognizant of the new. So we do need new language. I think that's one of the, and that I think will continue to emerge. Teilhard, in his own time, tried to form new language around some of his own concepts, but they never took root. And that's the thing, language has to be repeated because it conveys content. So how do we describe this new person on the horizon. I actually came up with a term, since I put the question out, that I put in a paper. Instead of calling ourselves persons, what if we were to think ourselves as life systems? In other words, we are personal life systems, or what I might call AI life systems. A person still connotes something individual. And I think we need a concept that allows us to see ourselves embedded within not only the systems within our own personal sphere, but that our own sphere is embedded in other spheres of life systems, so that we're always systems within systems within systems, so that we're not something that excluded from the natural world, or, we're not something that's on top of the animal chain, that we're something that's, in a sense, emerging from a much greater wholeness. So I might just start talking of us as AI or humanoid life systems, if I can use that term.
It seems like we need new language for even things like religion and God. I mean,
yes, I think
you can barely have a conversation because everybody has such a different understanding or experience of what that may mean to them, that most people who talk about religion, they do not think about, how it interconnects us and is the core of evolution. They're way far away from that. Probably
exactly.
Rigid set of beliefs that you follow because then maybe everything will turn out okay in life.
No, exactly. We have a lot of historical baggage around the language, the traditional language, right? And that baggage now is weighing us down. And it's like you can't sit on the same bus seat together because, my bags are heavier than yours. So we're like in each other's, terrain. But, shifting language is also a challenge because when you start to use new language, think of when we, finally got over the hump that God isn't like a big grandfather in the sky, that God is as male as God is female, and God is beyond male and female because God is God, and that was such a huge, oh my God. We went on forever with conferences and wars about, God is male and female. So we have a hard time moving, and that's always been, and it's funny because in the AI world, when you look at the rate of development in artificial intelligence and the way, interestingly, we seamlessly seem to be moving into it, even though itself comes up with new language, new concepts, there's something about the lore of AI that we're pulled into it without questioning too much, the new language that it's, evoking in us. Yet religion, we have this kind of reticence, oh my gosh, when you're going to move language and what are we going to do? We're not pulled into it. And so there's something about this core religious energy, this animating force at the heart of our lives that doesn't yet pull us in a seamless state. We're like, yeah, let's find new language. Let's use new language for divinity. And so we're lots and lots of baggage here, right? Because certainly from the Catholic perspective or Christian perspective is like new language. You can really, if you die tomorrow, you're going to be wound up right in the fires of hell because, you questioned, God or something. And it's like, people are like, oh no, maybe not. Maybe, we'll stay. So we're, so I really think God must be like, oh my God, these people are so I really think divinity has a great time with all of this because I think we're talking about the power of life and the key is life, and the absolute fullness of life. And that life is what? Love, because love is the fullness of relationality. And so I think we're silly people sometimes that we have boxed ourselves into these traps that alienate ourselves from ourselves and then from one another. And then we wind up in this downward spiral. We have so much potential, I think, to reconfigure our lives in the world today. But it does take a collective consciousness, first of all, and I think a collective interior freedom. And I think those are the two things right now I think we need to focus on, how free are we? And I would go back to, what is your name with the microscope? Tell me,
Oh, Ben.
Ben. You're Ben
Yeah.
who came up as Chris. Yeah.
Correct.
Are you a scientist or?
I'm a pathologist.
You're that. I think I met you right at the Living
Yeah,
School.
we met at the Living
I
School
thought
after your
so.
talk. It was
Yes, wonderful. Yeah, that's great, Ben.
wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're in a prime position, right? You're in the world of science, and probably encountering a lot of resistance in terms of religion and
Yeah, I mean, I live in a religiously sterile environment for the most
arrow,
part.
right?
Although most scientists are very spiritual, and when you survey them and ask them that.
Yeah.
But that's what's fascinating. But it's hard to talk. You can't talk. I mean,
No.
I brought up the term collective consciousness the other day in a meeting, and my chairman almost dropped dead. Like,
Yes.
what are you talking about? I'm like, better not use that language.
Yeah, you have the same problem the church does, right? So you can see the problems in the church are the same problems in the scientific community.
They are. So that's what I was getting at. It seems like in our institutions, they're all flawed in similar ways, and they're all basically falling apart.
They are.
If somebody doesn't, wake up and help remodel to something else. I mean, science has the same problems that the church has. I mean,
it does. I see that clearly. These and they're entrenched in, for all the progress of science philosophically. I think the principles are old. For as much as
most scientists are living in the 19th century or early 20th century, and the new science that's going on, most of those people ostracized just like prophets are.
Right.
Because they're breaking boundaries and transcending things and scaring the hell out of other people.
Yeah, exactly. And that's our job, really, is to be, to be boundary breakers. In fact, there's a whole thing in AI, in artificial intelligence, called the uncanny valley. I don't know if you're familiar with this. We're building robots that look like us, and exactly like us. So it's both alluring and fearful. And someone has likened that to the monstrosity of Christ. Now that, again, that term, the monstrosity of Christ, what we're talking about here is the radicality, in other words, this God becoming human is at once alluring, but it's also, it's frightening, And so what we're discovering here is the boundaries of nature are really fluid and porous. We have the capacity to not just do new things, but to really become something new. And I think that is what the incarnation in its root meaning is about. It's about something that is awesome and fearful, as well as alluring and enticing, and both science and religion keep those boundaries nice and neat, very categorical and very systematized. And I think what we need now is we need to awaken the prophets, in science and religion, and the freedom fighters, so to speak, who will push those boundaries of nature, which are waiting to be pushed, in my view, right? I think we know this, that nature itself is such a polyvalent, and the term itself is polyvalent. It can mean many things, and so we're not bounded. We are not fixed. Any boundedness or fixedness we have is really just for the moment that we're living in. I think it is.
Ilia, if I could jump in for a second, because I want to follow up on something Ben said also. And I'm an activist. I'm not a scientist, or I guess I'm a person of faith. And I see the systems breaking down in the whole activist world as well, in the political world. And I really loved something that you said in your blog about the church, when you said, unless fundamental levels of consciousness change, we cannot attract a new reality. And so how do we, we have to build the new reality. We have to build it not just in science, not just in faith, but in all of our systems. Every system is breaking down.
Right.
And I have friends who are, and some of these same people, Ilia, well-meaning people that work in the activist world, do really good work, but they're still stuck in things that they did 30 years ago or 40 years ago. Right. Their consciousness is in the same space. Right. And, try to get people to rethink. And, I've started telling people that, we have to get out of the political business and get into the transformational business. Yeah. And then we can bring about change. We're never bringing about change, whether it's through science, faith, or politics, we're never going to bring about change unless, as you just said, we transform first.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Patrick. I mean, I think that's really true. I think, and one of the problems I see, in a sense, whether it's, activist work or, anything else, I think our structures of relationship really come out of modernity. And by that, I think we've had a very binary structure of relationship. Me and it, or me and you, and so this kind of binary structure relationship really led to a privatization and individualism, right? If I want to be your friend type thing, it's a Newtonian world really at best. But I think what we need now is something that the Living School, has been focusing on, CCH, in Austin, your attention to centering prayer. And that is what Teilhard himself recognized, is that evolution needs the core animating power and energy of mysticism. It's really tapping into the mystical dimension of our lives. That, in other words, however that discipline is, whether it's yoga or centering or meditation, but that which we're looking for. And by saying that, what I am saying is that that mystical dimension of our lives actually moves us into a different structure of relationality. We move out of binary structuralism towards what I and someone else by the name of Timothy Rogers is calling triadic logic. And triadic logic always holds, this is Cynthia Bourgeault's law of three, by the way. It's, in other words, it's not just that you stand in opposition to the other, it's that you and the other are in a dialectical relationship where together you are bounded in an intermediate state of unknown creativity. And that's a structural thing. I think that's a way of structuring. And by the way, I think young people are doing this without even thinking about it. That's the funny thing. They're in it's a kind of relationship where there's a third, an intermediate that forms in that relationship. And that intermediate is an interlocking of the one and the other without being one and the other. And if it allows us to be without trying to make it into something, it can actually move both me and other into something new, into a new type of relationality. So I think we do need that transformation, Patrick, that you're talking about, I think is absolutely right, but I think it does need a new structure of relationality. It's how we, and where I put it priority, I think it is then deepening that mystical center or that core of our own lives, and only we can take that responsibility. In other words, we cannot do that for another. So it begins in that inner core of, and by that mystical center, I mean to know ourselves loved. I mean, I think that's really the heart of it. It's not just sitting with the unknown. It's sitting with the great known unknown, that we name as God. And so, I think as Thomas Merton says, it's not so much, seeking true love. It's to know that you are loved. And I think that's a lot of the problem. I'm not sure we know that we are loved. We are loved in a way that exceeds anything that we could ever grasp ourselves. That being known in love then is then the root of our freedom, that our inner freedom. And out of that, we enter into relationships with that, you might say, which in the past we might have rejected, might have passed by, but it's a relationship where we're not trying to change that other. That's the difference. And I think that's where the activist work is always like, we want to change this, right? We want to change this system. We want to change this person. And no, you let that person be, but you are in relationship to it without trying to change it. But in that relationship, you sit with what they are and what you are. And you wait until, you realize that there's a new way forward that is neither one nor the other. And I think we're going to have to work on that triadic logic of relationality towards something, towards a new way of forming relationships that are more integral up ahead.
Can I offer something?
Ilia.
Yeah, yes.
Go ahead.
Who's here? Gertie and yes.
Paul.
Okay.
Okay, Paul.
Okay, thank you. My question would be around the whole area of education, because I'd like to say, what are we contemplating? What are we praying? Like, what, if our consciousness is not moving towards an evolutionary consciousness, then because I was at the same meeting with Bernice, our community meeting, and there's really a strong resistance to education around this new consciousness, around evolution.
A resistance to it.
Yes, yeah.
Really? Yes.
And you have to kind of find the language or whatever, but I think that's an important part too of this.
And I think there's a way of doing this because, again, I think coming from the, religious circles, like some of the sisters would say, well, we've always been doing this, so why do we have to do something new? In a certain way, you don't have to throw out tradition entirely, but we do have to take it into a new level of consciousness. So first of all, I don't think people know what consciousness really is. That's probably, well, who does really, but that's a big question. But let me say this. I think a very simple question would be this. Something that Francis of Assisi asked, who are you, O Lord, and who am I? Who am I? You cannot exhaust that question. The more you enter into that question, who am I? You would have to come up against what you are not, and that then leads us to, the question of God. And so I think that question of depth, of a self-identity, is then the basis of coming to a new level of freedom in personhood, freedom in relationality, that we can then begin to engage, this question of God then on new and deeper levels. But what I hear from you and Bernice is getting stuck, or sisters getting stuck in this kind of like pattern, like, why do we have to do this? We've been there, done that. It's a binary way of thinking too, I think, which is also not helpful. Education is important, but you cannot lead a dead horse to water, right? And I think another thing is knowing when something has died. And I think sometimes we try to hold on to what is dead and what will not, cannot be raised to life. You have to know when to let go. And that's what's hard for us, right? It's hard because we're pretty sure we can get the dead horse alive, if we can douse it with water enough. And I don't think so. You have to know when to let go. It's about life. That's what we have to keep in mind. That's integral to the education. So where's Paul here? Did we lose Paul?
I'm right here.
There you are. Okay.
Very enjoying this in Minnesota here. I just wanted to offer to Patrick and a few others, for many, many years, even now, I am uncomfortable with being an activist. And I never really could understand why. And I felt kind of guilty about it until in the last few years, I started to read about and study Buddhism. And Thich Nhat Hanh has written a wonderful little book called Being Peace. And it really is about the middle way, the third person. I would recommend any activist read that because we need activists, but we also need contemplatives. And Father Richard talks about it, in his Center for Action and Contemplation. Where do you start? And he's even struggled with it. But I really think that the Buddhists have a fantastic approach to that middle way, that third person.
That's great.
We could learn from, and now I don't feel quite so bad.
No, thank you for sharing that. I would fully agree. There's a wealth in the wisdom of the Buddhist tradition in that sense of meditation. And another thing, Paul, just that you said that reminded me. I think with activism, we make the work an object, but what we're doing is we're abstracting that. In other words, we're going to change immigration laws.
Right.
So immigration laws are about people, and so I think what happened, especially in our modern world, we have fallen into levels of abstraction. And it's really just me and my, sense of what I think is right, working towards these abstract ideas, when in fact, was it Gandhi who said, be the change you want the world to be?
Exactly.
In other words, it is the transformed life that is transforming of other lives. So, or as one I had one little saying that said, the only lasting influence on earth is personal holiness or personal wholeness. I mean, when you meet someone who is peace and who is compassion,
Exactly.
no matter what is happening in your life, that makes a difference, And I do think that is much more effective in transforming in the long run. And that's why I'm going to say again, even as we, are in this evolutionary moment, we ourselves must be, in a sense, on a trajectory of transforming consciousness. Instead of worrying out there, how are we going to fix the bishops and the church and, all this stuff. And I'm saying, forget about it. They'll never, I wouldn't waste a lot of time on that. But what I do want to waste time on is entering ever more into the depths of that question, who am I? Finding my freedom in that. Grounding myself in the peace that God's love brings me, and then in freedom, participating in an unfolding world. And I think that's a way forward. And I have to tell you, in my own life, I do let go when something is. It's just the way I've always been. I just say, it's been great. It's been really fun, but I think we need to. You got to move on. You have to know, and it's a discerning moment. When to move on. But the Gospels are all about moving on. The whole point of Jesus, by the way, is he was an itinerant preacher. He wasn't, he didn't buy like a duplex in a neighborhood and stay there for, 30 years. If you don't find peace in this town, shake the dust, move on. And there's something about us that we've gotten used to stability. We've gotten used to like, oh, let's make this work, whether it's in the church or, and you do make it, you do try, but then you have to discern, is it time to move on? And I think that's a church question today. Is it time to move on to something new? Is it time, even in activism, is it time to find a new way forward, in a new structure of being? So,
Ilia, could I just add one thing?
Yes.
Hi, John Farron. Thank you for everyone for participating the way you are. I see this as a natural evolution, this whole conversation actually, as it went from Pam, to Ben, to Patrick, to Paul. And with Paul's last comments of Buddhism, the reality is that Christianity is about 1/3 of humankind. And Catholicism is even a smaller portion of that. So when we talk about the church itself, it's even a smaller portion than that. So when you say the church is dying, well, that may be so, but humanity isn't dying.
Oh, right. Yeah.
The whole concept of relationships, to me, is of utmost importance. But relationship, as you're saying, based upon what's inside of you, and with your questioning and your concerns, but relationships based upon love. So that's how I see this whole thing unfolding.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. I absolutely agree. I mean, one of my research areas is artificial intelligence. And so what I think artificial intelligence is doing for us, it's extending the relational dimension of our lives. So I think it's sort of I wouldn't say a litmus test, but it's a sign that we're not finished as human persons, as species in evolution, that we're in via. And it's another way of nature itself, in a sense, expanding the relational dimension of nature's own existence. So what I think, another way I put this is that we realize the challenging moments that we find ourselves in. And they're good challenges, in my view, but we also realize that we need to keep creating to move beyond these what seem to be impasses at time. And here's what I want to say. Nature is very, very creative. I think at the heart of nature itself is creativity. In other words, nature will always find, it will use the tools of the environment. It will rearrange itself. Nature is just an amazing, and we are part of nature. Nature is not part of us, and so what we are saying is creativity is really at the heart of our existence. And finding that freedom, finding that inner sense, that core of what we're about, that is tapping into the creative dimension of our lives that does then can contribute to a deeper relationality. Anyone, is there any other question, or?
I have a question about artificial intelligence, and do you, I've actually started to get involved with that just by serendipity a little bit. Working with software people to essentially teach a computer how to diagnose cancer, and or help what I do and help in my job in terms of visual analysis by artificial intelligence. And I guess my question is how do you see, I guess in some sense, artificial intelligence could be part of this looking to technology for a salvation, or is it something like you're getting at that may be helping with our relationality? It's really not clear to me if it's really part of the total unraveling of what we've been doing, or is it the future? You know, is it how we're evolving?
I think it's the future, Ben, but in this way, I think we have treated technology too much as a tool. In other words, it's something that helps me do what I'm doing. But the fact is, you or someone has created that. In other words, there's something about us that has been put into that device or that computer. And that's the self-extension of us into another form of, of existence. And so what I see with technology is it's not an either or, it's not like a me and it type thing, rather that what we are is now being extended. Because, I think Ed Olson, it'd be interesting to hear from him, because, what we're realizing is that the more fundamental layers of nature, so to speak, I mean, you get down to the nitty gritty of stuff, it's all about information systems, right? On the fundamental levels of life. And so what we're saying is that these informational systems are really now being extended into new mediums, that we call artificial intelligence. So I think the word artificial may actually be a detractor for us. I'm not sure it's the best word. I would rework that term, but I'm not going to do that anytime soon. It's a form of extending ourselves, our minds, our ability to do into new mediums. And so I think it's part of us that enables us then to function in a more efficient way, a better way, I mean, that's fantastic, actually, to be able to detect, computerized detection of cancer and stuff. So.
Yeah, we're trying to use it to improve quality of care. So.
Yeah. So what's interesting, there's a very good book by the physicist David Bohm, who he wrote with another physicist, David Peat, and it's on science, chaos, and complexity, where they argue that the core of science, like the core of religion, is creativity. And I've actually started to do some work going back to the philosophical grounds of things, going back to Aristotle, where creativity is actually the philosophical ground of existence itself. And so what nature does is it will always become something new. There's newness, novelty is at the heart of nature. And from from a theistic perspective, I would say the heart of that novelty, that novel transcendence, that novel creative transcendence, is that divinity that we name as God.
Ilia, this is Ed Olson.
Hi, Ed.
That comment about creativity, I think you started out with talking about finding the inner center of freedom, and I think that's where creativity is. I wanted to link that with another thing you said, that theology needs to be updated by a dialogue with science.
Yes.
For many years I've been working in that dialogue, but I find it doesn't get very far unless you're connected to that inner core, that inner freedom where you can be creative and let go and see new possibilities and so on.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really true, Ed. And as Ben was sharing, as a scientist, he does not find all the time, other scientists on board with, his sort of looking at things in a more integrated way in terms of science and religion. So it does require the inner work, so to speak, of knowing oneself within and having a deepened consciousness of what it means to exist, whether as from both a scientific, physical, spiritual or religious type of the dimensions of life. But really, that's what we're just talking about, the multi-dimensions of life,
Mm-hmm.
So, great. All right. This is a really good conversation, I have to tell you. So I really appreciate it. Is there anyone else, or did I not hear from anyone who would like to participate at all? Okay. Well, it's 10 after 8 at my time, and I have to go mark papers now. So we have a reality check. So I just want to thank you for joining this conversation. It's really been enriching, and I hope you get a sense. And let me just say this: I think we need to keep reading, but even more so reflecting. I really think it's sitting in that silent inner space in a deepened reflection on these ideas that we're sharing. And the beauty of this conference type of endeavor is that we can share some of these ideas, and I think we begin to realize we're not alone, although we can feel alone at times, because we meet a lot of people who are not thinking along these lines, or who might say, that's ridiculous, it's new agey, it's, really out there stuff. But as we were just saying, that out there stuff is what the edge of evolution is about. And so I think that's what we're saying. We are called, maybe that's our mission. We're called on the edge of evolution. And so I would say, live it well, and do not be afraid. Again, I have to go back to the words of the gospel, trust, don't fear, that, love itself can never be outdone by anything. So
Billy, I have a quick question.
oh, hi, Bill.
How you doing?
Good.
Quick question. I joined late, and I was wondering, is there any recommendations for reading that you have in light of this conversation? I just got your latest book, and I'm enjoying it.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, I mentioned the book on David Bohm's book. Are you familiar with the physicist David Bohm?
Yeah.
Yeah. His book on science, chaos, and complexity.
Okay, I heard that.
Yeah, with David Pete. That's a really good one. I'm trying to think.
Any books on artificial intelligence?
I'm hoping to write one, actually. Yeah, to pull a lot of this together in the spring. I can't say offhand, no one's really thinking along the lines that I'm thinking. A lot of it is just sort of all over. So I'd like to pull it together.
Look forward to it.
So if you guys could just hang in there for a few months, there'll be some new things on the horizon. Nothing comes to, stuff that you're already reading is, pretty much what's out there. But there's not a lot of people thinking along these trajectories. There are some, but who are really writing and pulling these ideas together to give us a better framework and a better structure, if I can use that language, towards which we can move our lives into something more whole. So patience and perseverance bring everything.
I was just going to throw out the idea of Ken Wilber. He's written Integral Meditation.
Yeah.
An amazing synthesis of psychology and spirituality.
Yeah.
Along the lines of what you're talking about.
Thanks, Bill. That's a good suggestion. And Wilbur is incredible. Really a genius.
And what I really heard you saying, Ilia, was take the time to really reflect upon what we're absorbing, and
yes,
not just consuming, but really taking the time together to reflect on it.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for using that word, because I do think, I think consumerism has so kind of seeped through our systems that we think of everything as taking it in and taking in. And I do think there comes a time where we have to say, we have enough, now we need to sit with it and to see, how that is changing us. And then we have to respond. We have to respond to what we've received. So it is always a dynamic flow of receptivity and response. I think we live in that flow. Okay, friends.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.